Chapter 15 of The Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 15. The Present Holder. Mr. Paul turned sharply on his companion as Viner pulled him up. He saw the direction of Viner's suddenly arrested gaze, and looked from him to the two men, who had now walked down the steps of the house and were advancing towards them. "What is it?" he asked. "Those fellows are coming away from Lord Ellingham's house. You seem to know them." "One of them," murmured Viner. "The clean-shaven man. Look at him." The two men came on in close, evidently absorbed conversation, passed Mr. Paul and Viner without as much as a glance at them, and went along in the direction of Park Lane. "Well?" demanded Mr. Paul. "The clean-shaven man is the man I told you of. The man who was in conversation with Ashton at that tavern in Notting Hill the night Ashton was murdered," answered Viner. "The other man I don't know." Mr. Paul turned and looked after the retreating figures. "You're sure of that?" he asked. "Certain," replied Viner. "I should know him anywhere." Mr. Paul came to another halt, glancing first at the two men, now well up the street, and then at the somewhat sombre front of Ellingham House. "Now this is an extraordinary thing, Viner!" he exclaimed. "There's the man who, you say, was with Ashton not very long before he came to his end, and we find him coming away, presumably from Lord Ellingham, certainly from Lord Ellingham's house. What on earth does it mean? And I wonder who the man is." "What I'd like to know," said Viner, "is who is the other man? But as you say, it is certainly a very curious thing that we should find the first man evidently in touch with Lord Ellingham, considering our recent discoveries. But what are you going to do?" "Going in here," affirmed Mr. Paul, "to the fountain head. We may get to know something. Have you a card?" The footman who took the cards looked doubtfully at them and their presenters. "His lordship is just going out," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't know." Mr. Paul pointed to the name of his firm at the corner of his card. "I think Lord Ellingham will see me," he said. "Tell his lordship I shall not detain him many minutes if he will be kind enough to give me an interview." The man went away, to return in a few minutes, and to lead the callers into a room at the rear of the hall, wherein, his back to the fire, his look and attitude one of puzzled surprise, stood a very young man, dressed in the height of fashion, who, as his servant had said, was obviously just ready to go out. Viner, remembering what had brought him and Mr. Paul there, looked at Lord Ellingham closely. He seemed to be frank, ingenuous, and decidedly youthful. But there was something decidedly practical and businesslike in his greeting of his visitors. "I'm afraid I can't give you very long, Mr. Paul," he said, glancing instinctively at the old lawyer. "I've a most important engagement in half an hour, and it won't be put off. But I can give you 10 minutes." "I am deeply obliged to your lordship," answered Mr. Paul. "As your lordship will have seen from my card, I am one of the partners in Crawle, Paul and Rattenbury, a firm not at all unknown, I think. Allow me to introduce my friend Mr. Viner, a gentleman who is deeply concerned and interested in the matter I want to mention to your lordship." Lord Ellingham responded politely to Viner's bow and drew 2 chairs forward. "Sit down, Mr. Paul. Sit down, Mr. Viner," he said. He dropped into a chair near a desk, which stood in the centre of the room, and looked interrogatively at his elder visitor. "Have you some business to discuss, Mr. Paul?" he asked. "Some business, my lord, which, I confess at once, is of extraordinary nature," answered the old lawyer. "I will go straight to it. Your lordship has doubtless read in the newspapers of the murder of a man named Ashton in Lonsdale Passage, in the Bayswater district?" Lord Ellingham glanced at a pile of newspapers which lay on a side table. "Yes," he answered, "I have. I've been much interested in it as a murder. A curious and mysterious case, don't you think?" "We," replied Mr. Pawle, waving a hand toward Viner, "know it to be a much more mysterious case than anybody could gather from the newspaper accounts, for they know little who have written them. And we, who are behind the scenes, know a great deal. Now, your lordship will have seen that a young man, an actor named Langton Hyde, has been arrested and charged and is on remand. This unfortunate fellow was an old schoolmate of Mr. Viner. They were at Rugby together. And Mr. Viner, and I may say I myself also, is convinced beyond doubt of his entire innocence, and we want to clear him. We are doing all we can to clear him. And it is because of this that we have ventured to call on your lordship." "Oh!" exclaimed Lord Ellingham. "But what can I do? How do I come in?" "My lord," said Mr. Pawle in his most solemn manner, "I will go straight to this point also. We have reason to feel sure, from undoubted evidence, that Mr. John Ashton, a very wealthy man who had recently come from Australia, where he had lived for a great many years, to settle here in London, had in his possession, when he was murdered, certain highly important papers relating to your lordship's family, and that he was murdered for the sake of them." The puzzled expression which Viner had noted in Lord Ellingham's boyish face when they entered the room grew more and more marked as Mr. Pawle proceeded, and he turned on the old lawyer at the end with a stare of amazement. "You really think that?" he exclaimed. "I shall be very much surprised if I'm not right," declared Mr. Pawle. "But what papers?" asked Lord Ellingham. "And how could this Mr. Ashton, who, you say, came from Australia, be in possession of papers relating to my family? I never heard of him." "Your lordship," said Mr. Pawle, "is doubtless well aware that some years ago there was a very strange, shall we call it romance, in your family? A very remarkable episode, anyway, a most unusual—" "You mean the strange disappearance of my uncle, this Lord Marketstoke?" interrupted Lord Ellingham with a smile. "Oh, of course, I know all about that." "Very well, my lord," continued Mr. Pawle. "Then your lordship is aware that Lord Marketstoke was believed to have gone to the colonies, Australia or New Zealand, and was lost there. His death was presumed. Now, Ashton came from Australia, and, as I say, we believe him to have brought with him certain highly important papers relative to Lord Marketstoke, whom we think to have been well known to him at one time. Indeed, we felt sure that Ashton knew Lord Marketstoke's secret. Now, my lord, we are also confident that whoever killed John Ashton did so in order to get hold of certain papers which, I feel certain, Ashton made a habit of carrying on his person, papers relating to his friend Lord Marketstoke's identity." Lord Ellingham remained silent for a moment, looking from one visitor to another. It was very clear to Viner that some train of thought had been aroused in him and that he was closely pursuing it. He fixed his gaze at last on the old lawyer. "Mr. Pawle," he said quietly, "have you any proof, undoubted proof, that Mr. Ashton did possess papers relating to my long missing uncle?" "Yes," answered Mr. Pawle, "I have." He pulled out the bundle of papers which he and Viner had unearthed from the Japanese cabinet. "This it is a packet of letters written by the seventh Countess of Ellingham to her elder son, the Lord Marketstoke we are talking of, when he was a boy at Eton. Your lordship will probably recognize your grandmother's handwriting." Lord Ellingham bent over the letter which Mr. Pawle spread before him. "Yes," he said, "I know the writing quite well. And these were in Mr. Ashton's possession?" "We have just found them, Mr. Viner and I, in a cabinet in his house," replied Mr. Pawle. "They are the only papers we have so far been able to bring to light. But, as I have said, we are convinced there were others, much more important ones, in his possession, probably in his pocket-book." Lord Ellingham handed the letters back. "You think that this Mr. Ashton was in possession of a secret relating to the missing man, my uncle Lord Marketstoke?" he asked. "I am convinced of it," declared Mr. Pawle. Lord Ellingham glanced shrewdly at his visitors. "I should like to know what it was," he said. "Your lordship feels as I do," remarked Mr. Pawle. "But now I should like to ask a question which arises out of this visit. As we approached your lordship's door just now, we saw, leaving it, two men. One of them my friend Mr. Viner immediately recognized. He does not know who the man is." "Which of the two men do you mean?" interrupted Lord Ellingham. "I may as well say that they had just left me." "The clean-shaven man," answered Viner. "Whom Mr. Viner knows for a fact to have been in Ashton's company only an hour or so before Ashton's murder." Lord Ellingham looked at Viner in obvious surprise. "But you do not know who he is?" he exclaimed. "No," replied Viner, "I don't. But there is no doubt of the truth of what Mr. Pawle has just said. This man was certainly with Mr. Ashton at a tavern in Notting Hill from about 9:30 to 10:30 on the evening of Ashton's death. In fact, they left the tavern together." The young nobleman suddenly pulled open a drawer in his desk, produced a box of cigarettes, and silently offered it to his visitors. He lighted a cigarette himself, and for a moment smoked in silence. It seemed to Viner that his youthful face had grown unusually grave and thoughtful. "Mr. Pawle," he said at last, "I am immensely surprised by what you've told me, and all the more so because this is the second surprise I've had this afternoon. I may as well tell you that the two gentlemen whom you saw going away just now brought me some very astonishing news. Yours comes right on top of it. And if you please, I'd rather not say any more about it just now, but I'm going to make a proposal to you. Will you and Mr. Viner, if he'll be so good, meet me tomorrow morning, say at noon, at my solicitor's offices?" "With pleasure," responded Mr. Pawle. "Your lordship's solicitors are?" "Carless and Driver, Lincoln's Inn Fields," answered Lord Ellingham. "Friends of ours," said Mr. Pawle. "We will meet your lordship there at 12 o'clock to the minute." "And you'll bring that with you?" suggested Lord Ellingham, pointing to the packet of letters which Mr. Pawle held in his hand. "Just so, my lord," assented Mr. Pawle. "And we'll be ready to tell all we know, for there are further details." Outside the house the old lawyer gripped Viner's elbow. "That boy knows something," he said with a meaning smile. "He's astute enough for his age, smart youngster. But what does he know? Those two men have told him something. Viner, we must find out who that clean-shaven man is. I have some idea that I have seen him before. I shouldn't be at all surprised if he's a solicitor. We may have seen him in some court or other. But in that case I wonder he didn't recognize me." "He didn't look at you," replied Viner. "He and the other man were too much absorbed in whatever it was they were talking about. I have been wondering since I first saw him at the tavern," he continued, "if I ought not to tell the police what I know about him, I mean. That he was certainly in Ashton's company on the evening of the murder. What do you think?" "I think not at present," replied Mr. Pawle. "It seems evident, unless indeed it was all a piece of bluff, and it may have been, that this man is or was, when you saw him, just as ignorant as the landlord of that place was, that the man who used to drop in there and Ashton were one and the same person. No, let the police go on their own lines. We're on others. We shall hear of this man again, whoever he is. Now I must get back to my office. Come there at 11:30 tomorrow morning, Viner, and we'll go on to Carless and Driver's." Viner went thoughtfully homeward, ruminating over the events of the day, and entered his house to find his two guests, the sisters of the unlucky Hyde, in floods of tears, and Miss Penkridge looking unusually grave. The elder Miss Hyde sprang up at sight of him and held a tear-soaked handkerchief towards him in pantomimic appeal. "Oh, Mr. Viner!" she exclaimed. "You are so kind and so clever. I'm sure you'll see a way out of this. It looks, oh, so very black, and so very much against him. But oh dear, Mr. Viner, there must be some explanation." "But what is it?" asked Viner, looking from one to the other. "What has happened? Has any one been here?" Miss Penkridge silently handed to her nephew an early edition of one of the evening newspapers and pointed to a paragraph in large type. And Viner rapidly read it over to the accompaniment of the younger Miss Hyde's sobs. A sensational discovery in connection with the recent murder of Mr. Ashton in Lonsdale Passage, Bayswater, was made in the early hours of this morning. Charles Fisher, a greengrocer carrying on business in the Harrow Road, found, in his woodshed, concealed in a nook in the wall, a parcel containing Mr. Ashton's gold watch and chain and a diamond ring. He immediately communicated with the police, and these valuables are now in their possession. It will be remembered that Langton Hyde, the young actor who is charged with the murder, and who is now on remand, stated at the coroner's inquest that he passed the night on which the crime was committed in a shed in this neighbourhood. Viner read the news twice over. Then a sudden idea occurred to him, and he turned to leave the room. "I don't think you need be particularly alarmed about this," he said to the weeping sisters. "Cheer up till I return. I am going round to the police." Chapter 15. The Present Holder. Of the middle of things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 16. The Outhouse. Near the police station, Viner fell in with his solicitor, Felpham, who turned a corner in a great hurry. Felpham's first glance showed his client that their purposes were in common. "Seen that paragraph in the evening papers?" said Felpham, without preface. "By George! That's serious news. What a pity that Hyde ever made that statement about his doings on the night of the murder. It would have been far better if he'd held his tongue altogether." "He insisted on it in the end," answered Viner, "and in my opinion he was right. But you think this is very serious?" "Serious? Yes!" exclaimed Felpham. "He says he spent the night in a shed in the Harrow Road district. Now the things that were taken from Ashton's body are discovered in such a place nay, the very place, for if you remember, Hyde particularized his whereabouts. What's the obvious conclusion? What can anybody think?" "I see two or three obvious conclusions, and I think several things," remarked Viner. "I'll tell you what they are when you've seen Drillford. I'm not alarmed about this discovery, Felpham. I think it may lead to finding the real murderer." "You see further than I do, then," muttered Felpham. "I only see that it's highly dangerous to Hyde's interests, and I want first-handed information about it." Drillford, discovered alone in his office, smiled as the two men walked in. There was an irritating "I told you so" air about him. "Ah!" he said. "I see you gentlemen have been reading the afternoon papers. What do you think about your friend now, Mr. Viner?" "Precisely what I thought before and shall continue to think," retorted Viner. "I've seen no reason to alter my opinion." "Oh, but I guess Mr. Felpham doesn't think that way," replied Drillford, with a shrewd glance at the solicitor. "Mr. Felpham knows the value of evidence, I believe." "What is it that's been found exactly?" asked Felpham. Drillford opened a locked drawer, lifted aside a sheet of cardboard, and revealed a fine gold watch and chain and a diamond ring. These lay on two or three sheets of much crumpled paper of a peculiar quality. "There you are," said Drillford. "Those belonged to Mr. Ashton. There's his name on the watch, and a mark of his inside the ring. They were found early this morning, hidden in the very place in which Hyde confessed that he spent most of the night after Ashton's murder, a shed belonging to one Fisher, a greengrocer, up the Harrow Road." "Who found them?" demanded Felpham. "Fisher himself," answered Drillford. He was pottering about in his shed before going to Covent Garden. He wanted some empty boxes, and in pulling things about he found these. Couldn't have made a more important find, I think." "Where are these things loose?" asked Viner. "Wrapped loosely in the paper they're lying on," replied Drillford. Viner took the paper out of the drawer, examined it, and lifted it to his nose. "I wonder if Hyde really did put those things there," he said. "How Hyde came to be carrying about with him these sheets of paper which had certainly been used before for the wrappings of chemicals or drugs." Felpham pricked his ears. "Eh?" he said. "What's that?" "Smell for yourself," answered Viner. "Let the inspector smell too. I draw the attention to both of you to the fact because we'll raise that point whenever it's necessary. Those papers have at some time been used to wrap some strong-smelling drug." "No doubt of it," said Felpham, who was applying the papers to his nose. "Smell them, Drillford. As Mr. Viner says, what would Hyde be doing with this stuff in his pocket?" "That's a mere detail," remarked Drillford impatiently. "These chaps that mooch about as Hyde was doing pick up all sorts of odds and ends. He may have pinched them from a chemist's shop. Anyway, there's the fact it will hang him on it, you'll see." "We shall never see anything of the sort," said Viner. "You're on the wrong tack, Inspector. Let me put two or three things to your intelligence. Where's Ashton's purse? I know for a fact that Ashton had a purse full of money when he went out of his house that night. Mrs. Killenhall and Miss Wickham saw him take it out just before he left to give some cash to the parlour maid, and they saw him replace it in his trousers pocket. I also know for another fact where he spent money that evening. In short, I know now a good deal about his movements for some hours before his death." "Then you ought to tell us, Mr. Viner," said Drillford a little sulkily. "You ought not to keep any information to yourself." "You're going on the wrong tack, or I might," retorted Viner. "But you'll know all in good time. Now, I ask you again, where's Ashton's purse? You know as well as I do that when his clothing was examined, almost immediately after his death, all his effects were gone watch, chain, rings, pocketbook, purse. If Hyde took the whole lot, do you think he would ever have been such a consummate ass as to wait until next morning to pawn that ring in Edgware Road? The idea is preposterous." "And why, pray?" demanded Drillford, obviously nettled at the turn which the conversation was taking. "I wonder your own common sense doesn't tell you," said Viner with intentional directness. "If Hyde took everything from his victim, as you say he did, he would have had a purse full of ready money. He could have gone off to some respectable lodging house. He could have put 100 miles between himself and London by breakfast time. He would have had ready money to last him for months. But he was starving when he went to the pawnbroker's. Hyde told you the truth. He never had anything but that ring." "Good!" muttered Felpham. "Good, Viner! That's one in the eye for you, Drillford." "Another thing that you're forgetting, Inspector," continued Viner. "I suppose you attach some value to probabilities. Do you, as a sensible man, believe for one moment that Hyde, placed in the position he is, would be such a fool, such a suicidal fool, as to tell you about that particular shed if he'd really hidden those things there? The mere idea is absurd, ridiculous." "Good again, Viner," said Felpham. "He wouldn't." Drillford, obviously ill pleased, put the strong-smelling paper and the valuables which had been wrapped in it back in the drawer and turned the key. "All very well talking and theorizing, Mr. Viner," he said sullenly. "We know from his own lips that Hyde did spend the night in that shed. If he didn't put these things there, who did?" Viner gave him a steady look. "The man who murdered and robbed Ashton," he answered. "And that man was not Hyde." "You'll have that to prove," retorted Drillford derisively. "I know what a jury'll think with all this evidence before it." "We shall prove a good many things that'll surprise you," said Viner quietly. "And you'll see then the foolishness of jumping at what seems to be an obvious conclusion." He motioned Felpham to follow, and going outside, turned in the direction of the Harrow Road. "I am going to have a look at the place where these things were found," he said. "Come with me. You see for yourself," he continued as they walked on, "how ridiculous it is to suppose that Hyde planted them. The whole affair is plain enough to me. The real murderer read, or may have heard, Hyde's statement before the coroner, and in order to strengthen the case against Hyde, and divert suspicion from himself, sought out this shed and put the things there. Clumsy! If Hyde had ever had the purse, which more certainly disappeared with the rest of the property, he'd never have gone to that shed at all. "We'll make the most of all that," said Felpham. "But I gathered from what you said just now to Drillford that you know more about this case than you've let out. If it's in Hyde's favour " "I can't tell you what I know," answered Viner. "I do know some strange things which will all come out in good time. If we bring the murder home to the right man, Hyde of course will be cleared. I'll tell everything as soon as I can, Felpham." They walked quickly forward until they came to the higher part of the Harrow Road. There, at a crowded point of that dismal thoroughfare, where the shops were small and mean, Felpham suddenly lifted a finger towards a sign which hung over an open front filled with the cheaper sorts of vegetables. "Here's the place," he said. "A corner shop. The shed, of course, will be somewhere behind." Viner looked with interest at the refuge which Hyde had chosen after his hurried flight from the scene of the murder. A shabby-looking street ran down from the corner of the greengrocer's shop. The first 20 yards of it on that side were filled with palings, more or less broken and dilapidated; behind them lay a yard in which stood a van, 2 or 3 barrows, a collection of boxes and baskets and crates, and a lean-to shed built against the wall of the adjoining house. The door of this yard hung loosely on its rusty hinges. Viner saw at once that nothing could be easier than for a man to slip into this miserable shelter unseen. "Let's get hold of the tenant," he said. "Better show him your card, and then he'll know we're on professional business." The greengrocer, a dull-looking fellow who was measuring potatoes, showed no great interest on hearing what his callers wanted. Summoning his wife to mind the shop, he led Viner and Felpham round to the yard, and opened the door of the shed. This was as untidy as the yard, and filled with a similar collection of boxes, baskets and crates. In one corner lay a bundle of empty potato sacks. The greengrocer at once pointed to it. "I reckon that's where the fellow got a bit of sleep that night," he said. "There was nothing to prevent him getting in here no locks or bolts on either gate of the yard or that door. He may have been in here many a night, for all I know." "Where did you find those valuables this morning?" asked Viner. The greengrocer pointed to a shelf in a corner above the bundle of sacking. "There!" he answered. "I wanted some small boxes to take down to Covent Garden, and in turning some of these over I came across a little parcel, wrapped in paper, slipped under a box that was turned top downwards on the shelf, you understand. So of course I opened it, and there was the watch and chain and ring." "Just folded in the papers that you handed to the police?" suggested Viner. "Well, there was more paper about 'em than what I gave to Inspector Drillford," said the greengrocer. "A well wrapped up bit of parcel it was. There's the rest of the paper there, where I threw it down." He pointed to some loose sheets of paper which lay on the sacking, and Viner went forward, picked them up, looked quickly at them, and put them in his pocket. "I suppose you never heard anything about that night?" he asked, turning to the greengrocer. "Not I," the man replied. "I sleep too sound to hear aught of that sort. There's nothing in here that's of any value. No, a dozen folk could come into this yard at night, and we shouldn't hear 'em. We sleep at the front of the house." Viner slipped some silver into the greengrocer's hand and led Felpham away. And when they reached a quieter part of the district, he pulled out the papers which he had picked out of the corner in the shed and held them in front of his companion's eyes. "We did some good in coming up here, after all, Felpham," he said, with a grim smile. "It wasn't a mere desire to satisfy idle curiosity that made me come. I thought I might, by sheer good luck, hit on something or some idea that would help. Now then, look at these things. That's a piece of newspaper from out of a copy of the Melbourne Argus of September 6th last. Likely thing for Langton Hyde to be carrying in his pocket, eh?" "Good heavens, that's certainly important!" exclaimed Felpham. "And so is this, and perhaps much more so," said Viner, making a second exhibit. That's a sheet of brown wrapping paper with the name and address of a famous firm of wholesale druggists and chemical manufacturers on one side, printed. It's another likely thing for Hyde to possess and to carry about, isn't it?" "And the same bitter, penetrating smell about it," said Felpham. "Hyde, of course, if Drillford is correct, had all this paper in his pocket when he went into that shed," said Viner. "But I have a different idea, and a different theory. Here," he went on, folding his discoveries together neatly, "you take charge of these, and take care of them. They may be of more importance than we think." He went home full of thought, restored the sisters to something like cheerfulness by assuring them that the situation was no worse, and possibly rather better, and spent the rest of the evening in his study, silently working things out. Viner, by the time he went to bed, had evolved an idea, and it was still developing and growing stronger when he set out next morning to accompany Mr. Pawle to Lord Ellingham's solicitors. End of chapter 16. The Outhouse. Chapter 17 of The Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 17. The Claimant. Carless and Driver practiced their profession of the law in one of the old houses on the south side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, a house so old that it immediately turned Viner's thought to what he had read of the days wherein Inigo Jones exercised his art up the stately frontages, and duels were fought in the gardens which London children now sport in. In one of these houses lived Blackstone, in another Erskine. One ancient roof once sheltered John Milton, another heard the laughter of Nell Gwynn. Up the panelled staircase which Mr. Pawle and his companion were presently conducted, the feet of many generations had trod, and the room into which they were duly conducted was so old-world in appearance, with its oaken walls and carving, and old-fashioned furniture, that nothing but the fact that its occupants wore 20th-century garments would have convinced Viner that he had not been suddenly thrown back to the days of Queen Anne. Lord Ellingham was already there when they arrived, in conference with his solicitor, Mr. Carless, a plump, rosy, active gentleman who wore mutton-chop whiskers, and, secretly, prided himself on his likeness to the type of fox-hunting squire. It was very evident to Viner that both solicitor and client were in a state of expectancy bordering on something very like excitement. And Mr. Carless, the preliminary greetings being over, plunged at once into the subject. "I say, Pawle," he exclaimed, turning at once to his fellow practitioner, "this appears to be a most extraordinary business. His lordship has just been telling me all about the two calls he had yesterday, first from two men whom he'd never seen before, then from you two, who were also strangers. He has also told me what both lots of his callers had to say, and hang me if I ever heard of two such curious unfoldings coming one on top of the other. Sounds like a first-class mystery." "You forget," remarked Mr. Pawle with a glance at Lord Ellingham, "that we don't know, Mr. Viner and myself, what it was that his lordship's first couple of callers told him. He left that until today." Mr. Carless looked at his client, who nodded his head as if in assent to something in the glance. "Well, as I'm now in possession of the facts," said he, "I'll tell you, Pawle. His lordship has given me a clear account of what his first caller said, and what you and Mr. Viner added to it. The two men whom you saw coming away from Ellingham House were Methley and Woodlesford, two solicitors who are in partnership in Edgware Road. I know of them. I think we've had conveyancing business with them once or twice. Quite a respectable firm, in a smallish way, you know, but all right so far as I know anything of them. Now, they came to Lord Ellingham yesterday afternoon with a most extraordinary story. His lordship tells me that he learnt from your talk with him yesterday afternoon that you are pretty well acquainted, you and Mr. Viner, with his family history, so I'll go straight to the point. What do you think Methley and Woodlesford came to tell him? You'd never guess." "I won't try," answered Mr. Pawle. "What then?" Mr. Carless smiled grimly. "That the long lost Lord Marketstoke was alive and in England," he said. "Here, in fact, in London." Mr. Pawle smiled too, but his smile was not grim. It was, rather, the smile of a man who hears what he has been expecting to hear. "I thought it would be something of that sort!" he exclaimed. I fancied that would be the game." "You think it a game?" suggested Mr. Carless. "And a highly dangerous one, as somebody will find out," responded Mr. Pawle. "But what did these fellows really say?" "His lordship will correct me if I miss anything pertinent," answered Mr. Carless with a glance at his client. "They said this that they had been called upon by a gentleman now staying at one of the private residential hotels in Lancaster Gate, who was desirous of legal assistance in an important matter, and had been recommended to them by a fellow boarder at the hotel. He then told them that though he was now passing under the name of Cave " "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle with a snort which denoted a certain sort of surprised satisfaction. "Ah, to be sure! Cave, of course! But I interrupt you. Pray proceed." "I see your point," remarked Mr. Carless with a smile. "Well, although he was passing under the name of Cave, he was, in strict reality, the Lord Marketstoke who disappeared from England many years ago, who was never heard of again, and whose death had been presumed. He was therefore the rightful Earl of Ellingham, and as such entitled to the estates. He proceeded to tell Methley and Woodlesford his adventures. He had, he said, never at any time from boyhood been on good terms with his father; there had always been mutual dislike. As he grew to manhood, his father had thwarted him in every conceivable way. He himself, as a young man, had developed radical and democratic ideas. This had caused a further widening of the breach. Eventually he had made up his mind to clear out of England altogether. He had a modest amount of money of his own, a few thousands which had been left him by his mother, so he took this and quietly disappeared. According to his own account, he became a good deal of a rolling stone, going to various out of the way parts of the earth, and taking particular pains wherever he went to conceal his identity. He told these people, Methley and Woodlesford, that he had at one time or another lived and traded in South Africa, India, China, Japan, and the Malay settlement. Finally, he had settled down in Australia. He had kept himself familiar with events at home, knew of his father's death, and he saw no end of advertisements for himself. He was aware that legal proceedings were taken as regards the presumption of his death and the administration of the estates. He was also aware of the death of his younger brother, and that title and estates were now in possession of his nephew, his lordship there. In fact, he was very well up in the whole story, according to Methley and Woodlesford, said Mr. Carless with a smile, and Lord Ellingham believed that Methley and Woodlesford were genuinely convinced by him. "Seemed so, anyway, both of 'em," agreed Lord Ellingham. "However," continued Mr. Carless, "Methley and Woodlesford, like you and I, Paul, are limbs of the law. They asked two very pertinent questions. First, why had he come forward after this long interval? Second, what evidence had he to support and prove his claim?" "Good!" muttered Mr. Pawle. "And I'll be bound he had some excellent replies ready for them." "He had," said Mr. Carless. "He answered as regards the first question that of late things had not gone well with him. He was still comfortably off, but he had lost a lot of money in Australia through speculation. He replied to the second by producing certain papers and documents." "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle, nudging Viner. "Now we're warming to it." And according to what Methley and Whittlesford told Lord Ellingham, continued Mr. Carless, these papers and documents are of a very convincing nature. They said to his lordship frankly that they were greatly surprised by them. They had thought that this man might possibly be a bogus claimant, who had somehow gained a thorough knowledge of the facts he was narrating, but the papers he produced, which, he alleged, had never been out of his possession since his secret flight from London, were, well, staggering. After inspecting them, Methley and Whittlesford came to the conclusion that their caller really was what he claimed to be, the missing man. "What were the papers?" demanded Mr. Pawle. "Oh," replied Mr. Carless, looking at his client, "letters, certificates, and the like, all, according to Methley and Whittlesford, excellent proofs of identity." "Did they show them to your lordship?" asked Mr. Pawle. "Oh, no, they only told me of them," answered Lord Ellingham. "They said, of course, that they would be shown to me or to Mr. Carless." "Aye," muttered Mr. Pawle. "Just so. Yes, and they will have to be shown." "That follows as a matter of course," observed Mr. Carless. "But now, Pawle, we come to the real point of the case. Methley and Whittlesford, having informed his lordship of all this when they called on him yesterday afternoon, then proceeded to tell him precisely what their client, the claimant, as we will now call him, really wanted, for he had been at some pains, considerable pains, to make himself clear on that point to them. And he desired them to make themselves clear to Lord Ellingham, whom he throughout referred to as his nephew. He had no desire, he told them, to recover his title nor the estates. He did not care a cent, his own phrase, for the title. He was now 60 years of age. The life he had lived had quite unfitted him for the positions and duties of an English nobleman. He wanted to go back to the country in which he had settled. But as title and estates really were his, he wanted his nephew, the present holder, to make him a proper payment, in consideration of the receipt of which he would engage to preserve the silence which he had already kept so thoroughly and effectively for 35 years. Eh?" "In plain language," said Mr. Pawle, "he wanted to be bought." "Precisely," agreed Mr. Carless. "Of course, Methley and Whittlesford didn't quite put it in that light. They put it that their client had no wish to disturb his nephew, but suggested kindly that his nephew should make him a proper payment out of his abundance." Mr. Pawle turned to Lord Ellingham. "Did they mention a sum to your lordship?" he asked. "Yes," replied Lord Ellingham with a smile at Carless. "They did tentatively." "How much?" asked Mr. Pawle. £100,000. "On receipt of which, I suppose," observed Mr. Pawle dryly, "nothing would ever be heard again of your lordship's long lost uncle, the rightful owner of all that your lordship possesses?" Lord Ellingham laughed. "So I gathered," he answered. "I wish I'd been present when Methley and Whittlesford put forward that proposition!" exclaimed the old lawyer. "Did they seem serious?" "Oh, I think they were quite serious," replied Lord Ellingham. "They seemed so. They spoke of it as what they called a domestic arrangement." "Excellent phrase," remarked Mr. Pawle. "And what said your lordship to their or the claimant's proposition?" "I told them that the matter was so serious that they and I must see my solicitors about it," answered Lord Ellingham, "and I arranged to meet them here at 1 o'clock today. They quite agreed that that was the proper thing to do, and went away. Then you and Mr. Viner called." "With, I understand, another extraordinary story," remarked Mr. Carless, "the particulars of which his lordship has also told me. Now, Pawle, what do you really say about all this?" Mr. Pawle smote his clenched right fist on the palm of his open left hand. "I will tell you what I say, Carless!" he exclaimed with emphasis. "I say that whatever the papers and documents were which were produced by this man to Methley and Whittlesford, they were stolen from the body of John Ashton, who was foully murdered in Lonsdale Passage only last week. I'll stake all I have on that. Now then, did this claimant steal them? Did he murder John Ashton for them? No, 1,000 times no, for no man would have been such a fool as to come forward with them so soon after his victim's death. This claimant doesn't know how or where or when they were obtained. He doesn't suspect that murder's in it. Now then, where did he get them? Who's at the back of him? Who, to be plain, who's making a cat's paw of him? Find that out, and we shall know who murdered John Ashton." Viner, glancing at Lord Ellingham and at Mr. Carless, saw that Mr. Pawle's words had impressed them greatly, the solicitor especially. He nodded sympathetically, and Mr. Pawle went on speaking. "Listen here, Carless," he continued. "Mr. Viner and I have been investigating this case as far as we could, largely to save a man whom we both believe to be absolutely innocent of murder. I have come to certain conclusions. John Ashton, many years ago, fell in with the missing Lord Marketstoke, then living under the name of Wickham, in Australia, and they became close friends. At some time or other Wickham told Ashton the real truth about himself, and when he died, left his little daughter." Carless looked sharply around. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "So there's a daughter?" "There is a daughter, and her name is Avice, a name borne by a good many women of the Cave Gray family," answered Mr. Pawle with a significant glance at his fellow practitioner. "But let me go on. Wickham left his daughter, her mother being dead, in Ashton's guardianship. She was then about 6 years of age. Ashton sent her to school here in England. About 12 or 13 years later he came home and settled in Markendale Square. He brought Avice Wickham to live with him. He handed over to her a considerable sum which he said her father had left in his hands for her. And then, secretly, Ashton went down to Marketstoke and evidently made certain inquiries and investigations. Whether he was going to reveal the truth as to what I have just told you, we don't know; probably he was. But he was murdered, and we all know when and where. And I say he was murdered for the sake of these very papers, which we now know were produced to Methley and Woodlesford by this claimant. Now then!" Mr. Carless suddenly bent forward. "A moment, Pawle," he said. "If this man Wickham really was the lost Lord Marketstoke, and he's dead, and he left a daughter, and the daughter's alive " "Well?" demanded Mr. Pawle. "Well?" "Why, then, of course, that daughter," said Mr. Carless slowly, "that daughter is " A clerk opened the door and glanced at his employer. "Mr. Methley and Mr. Woodlesford, sir," he announced. "By appointment." Chapter 17 The Claimant. The Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 18 Let Him Appear. The meeting between the solicitor suggested to Viner and to Lord Ellingham, who looked on curiously, while they exchanged formal greetings and explanations, a certain solemnity. Each of them seemed to imply, in look and manner, that this was an unusually grave occasion, and Mr. Carless, assuming the direction of things, became almost judicial in his deportment. "Well, gentlemen," he said, when they had all gathered about his desk, "Lord Ellingham has informed me of what passed between you and himself at his house yesterday. In plain language, the client whom you represent claims to be the Lord Marketstoke who disappeared so completely many years ago, and therefore the rightful Earl of Ellingham. Now, a first question. Do you, as his legal advisers, believe in his claim?" "Judging by the proofs with which he has furnished us, yes," answered Methley. "There seems to be no doubt of it." "We'll ask for these proofs presently," remarked Mr. Carless. "But now a further question. Your client, whom we'll now call the claimant, had, I understand, no desire to take up his rightful position, and suggests that the secret shall remain a secret, and that he shall be paid £100,000 to hold his tongue?" "If you put it that way, yes," replied Methley. "I don't know in what other way it could be put," said Mr. Carless grimly. "It's the plain truth. But now, if Lord Ellingham refuses that offer, does your client intend to commence proceedings?" "Our instructions are yes," answered Methley. "Very good," said Mr. Carless. "Now then, what are these proofs?" Methley turned to his partner, who immediately thrust a hand in his breast pocket and produced a long envelope. "I have them here," said Woodlesford. "Our client entrusted them to us, so that we might show them to Lord Ellingham if necessary. There are not many documents. They all relate to the period of our client's life before he left England. There are one or two important letters from his father, the seventh Earl, two or three from his mother. There is also his mother's will. There is one letter from his younger brother, to whom he had evidently more than once announced his determination of leaving home for a considerable time. There are two letters from your own firm relating to some property which Lord Marketstoke disposed of before he left London. There is a schedule or memorandum of certain personal effects which he left in his rooms at Ellingham Hall. There is also a receipt from his bankers for a quantity of plate and jewellery which he had deposited with them before leaving. These things had been left him by his mother. There are also two documents which he seems to have considered it worth while to preserve all these years," concluded Woodlesford with a smile. "One is a letter informing him that he had been elected a member of the M.C.C. The other is his commission as a Justice of the Peace for the county of Buckinghamshire." As he detailed these things, Woodlesford laid each specified paper before Mr. Carless, and then they all gathered round and examined each exhibit. The various documents were somewhat faded with age, and the edges of some were worn as if from long folding and keeping in a pocket-book. Mr. Carless hastily ran his eye over them. "Very interesting, gentlemen," he remarked, "but you know, as well as I do, that these things don't prove your client to be the missing Lord Marketstoke. A judge and jury would want a lot more evidence than that. The mere fact that your man is in possession of all these documents proves nothing whatever. He may have stolen them." "From what we have seen of our client, Mr. Carless," observed Methley, with some stiffness of manner, "there is no need for such a suggestion." "I dare say we shall all see a good deal of your client before this matter is settled, Mr. Methley," retorted Mr. Carless, "and even when I have seen a lot of him, I should still say the same. He may have stolen them. What else has he to prove that he's what he says he is?" "He is fully conversant with his family history," said Woodlesford. "He can give a perfectly full and, so far as we can judge, accurate account of his early life and of his subsequent doings. He evidently knows all about Ellingham Hall, Marketstoke and the surroundings. I think if you were to examine him on these points, you would find that his memory is surprisingly fresh." "I have no doubt that it will come to his being examined on a great many points, and in much detail," said Mr. Carless with a dry smile. "Of course I shall be much interested in seeing him. You see, I remember the missing Lord Marketstoke very well indeed. He was often in here when I, as a lad of 19 or 20, was articled to my own father. And now, gentlemen, I'll ask you a question and commend it to your intelligence and common sense. If your client is this man he claims to be, why didn't he come straight to Carless and Driver, whom he would remember well enough, instead of going to Methley and Woodlesford? Come, now!" Neither visitor answered this question, and Mr. Pawle suddenly turned on them with another. "Did your client mention to you that he knew Carless and Driver as the family solicitors?" he asked. "No, I can't say that he did," admitted Methley. "After all, 35 years' absence, you know." "You said just now that his memory was surprisingly fresh," interrupted Mr. Pawle. "Surely," replied Woodlesford, "surely you can't expect a man who has been away from England all that time to remember everything." "I should have expected Lord Marketstoke to have gone straight to the family solicitors anyway," retorted Mr. Pawle. "Obvious thing to do, if his story is a true one." Woodlesford glanced at his partner and repossessing himself of the documents began to arrange them in the envelope from which he had drawn them. "We cannot, of course, say positively who our client is or who he is not," he said. "All we can say is that he came to us with an introduction from an old client of ours whom we knew very well, and that his story seems to us to be quite credible. No doubt he can bring further proof. That he did not come here in the first instance. I'll tell you why I, personally, am very much surprised that he didn't," interrupted Mr. Carless. "You told Lord Ellingham yesterday that your client saw no end of advertisements for him at the time of his father's death. Now we, Carless and Driver, sent out those advertisements. Our name was appended to every one of them wherever they appeared. Why then, when this man, if he is the real man, returned home, did he not come to us? For there are 3 persons in this office who but wait!" He touched a bell. The clerk who had announced Methley and Woodlesford put his head in at the door. "Ask Mr. Portlethwaite to come here," commanded Mr. Carless, "and just find out if Mr. Driver is in his room. Portlethwaite can tell me when he comes." An elderly, grey-haired man presently appeared and closed the door behind him as if aware of the sacred nature of the proceedings. "Mr. Driver is out, Mr. Carless," he said. "You wanted me, I think?" "Our senior clerk," observed Mr. Carless, by way of introduction. "Portlethwaite. You remember the Lord Marketstoke who disappeared some 35 years ago?" Mr. Portlethwaite smiled. "Quite well, Mr. Carless," he answered. "As if it were yesterday. He used to come here a good deal, you know." "Do you think you'd know him again, Portlethwaite, after all these years?" asked Mr. Carless. "35 years, mind!" The elderly clerk smiled more assuredly than before. Then he looked significantly at a corner of the room, and Mr. Carless took the hint, and rising from his chair, went aside with him. Portlethwaite whispered something in his employer's ear, and Carless suddenly laughed and nodded. To be sure, I remember now," he said aloud. "Thank you, Portlethwaite, that's all. Well, gentlemen," he continued, returning to his desk when the clerk had gone, "I think the best thing you can do is to bring your client here. If he is the real and genuine article, he will, I am sure, be very glad indeed to meet three persons who knew him quite intimately in the old days. Mr. Driver, Mr. Portlethwaite, and myself. And I really don't know that there's any more to do or say." The two visitors rose, and Methley looked at Mr. Carless in a questioning fashion. "Am I to go away with the impression that you believe our client to be an imposter?" he said quietly. "Frankly, I do," answered Mr. Carless. "So do I!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle. "Emphatically so!" "In that case," said Methley, "I see no advantage in bringing him here." "Not even anything to your own advantage?" suggested Mr. Carless with a keen glance which passed from one partner to the other. "You, as reputable practitioners of our profession, don't want to be mixed up with an impostor?" "We should be very sorry to be mixed up in any way with an impostor, Mr. Carless," said Methley. Mr. Carless pursed his lips for a moment as if he were never going to open them again, then he suddenly relaxed them. "I tell you what it is, gentlemen," he said. "I'm only anticipating matters in saying what I'm going to say, and I'm saying it because I feel sure you are quite sincere and genuine in this affair and are being deceived. If you will bring your client here, there are three of us in this office who, as my old clerk has just reminded me, can positively identify him on the instant if he is the man he claims to be. Positively, I say, and at once. There!" "May one ask how?" said Woodlesford. "No!" exclaimed Mr. Carless. "Bring him! Telephone an appointment, and we'll settle the matter as soon as he sets foot inside that door." "May we tell him that?" asked Methley. "You can do as you like," answered Mr. Carless. "Between ourselves, I shouldn't. But I assure you we can tell in one glance that's a fact." The two solicitors went away, and Viner, who had closely watched Methley during the interview, followed them out and hailed Methley in the corridor outside Mr. Carless's room. "May I have a word with you?" he asked, drawing him aside. "I don't know if you remember, but I saw you the other night in the parlour of that old tavern in Notting Hill. You came in while I was there." "I had some idea that I remembered your face when we were introduced just now," said Mr. Methley. "Yes, I think I do remember. You were sitting in a corner near the hearth." "Just so," agreed Viner. "And I heard you ask the landlord a question about a gentleman whom you used to meet there sometimes. You left some specimen cigars with the landlord for him." "Yes," assented Methley wonderingly. "You never knew that man's name," continued Viner, "nor who he was. Just so so I gathered. Then I'll tell you. There was a good reason why he had not been to that tavern for some nights. He was John Ashton, the man who was murdered in Lonsdale Passage." Viner was watching his man with all the keenness of which he was capable, and he saw that this announcement fell on Methley as an absolute surprise. He started as only a man can start who has astounding news given to him suddenly. "God bless me!" he exclaimed. "You don't mean it! Of course I know about that murder our own district. And I saw Ashton's picture in the paper. But then there are so many elderly men of that type broad features, trimmed grey beard. Dear me, dear me! A very pleasant, genial fellow! I'm astonished, Mr. Viner!" Viner resolved on a bold step. He wouldn't take it without consulting Mr. Pawle or anybody. He drew Methley further aside. "Mr. Methley," he said, "you're a man of honour, and I trust you with a secret, to be kept until I release you from the obligation of secrecy. I have reasons for getting at the truth about Ashton's murder. So has Mr. Pawle. He and I have been making investigations and inquiries, and we are convinced, we are positive, that these papers which your partner now has in his pocket were stolen from Ashton's dead body. That, in fact, Ashton was murdered for the possession of them, and I tell you, for your own sake, find out who this client of yours is. That he was the actual murderer, I don't believe for a second. He is probably a mere cat's paw. But who's behind him? If you can do anything to find out the truth, do it." That Methley was astonished beyond belief was so evident that Viner was now absolutely convinced of his sincerity. He stood staring open-mouthed for a moment, then he glanced at Woodlesford, who was waiting at some distance along the corridor. "Mr. Viner," he said, "you amaze me. Listen, my partner is as sound and honest a fellow as there is in all London. Let me tell him this, I'll engage for his secrecy. If you'll consent to that, I'll see that, without a word from us as to why, this man who claims to be the missing Lord Marketstoke is brought here. If what you say is true, we are not going to be partners to a crime. Let me tell Woodlesford, I'll answer for him." Viner considered this proposition for a moment. "Very well," he said at last. "Tell him. I shall trust you both. Remember, it's between the three of us. I shan't say a word to Pawle, nor to Carless. You know there's a man's life at stake. Hyde's. Hyde is as innocent as I am. He's an old schoolfellow of mine." "I understand," said Methley. "Very well. Trust to me, Mr. Viner." He went off with a reassuring nod, and Viner returned to Mr. Carless' room. The three men he had left there were deep in conversation, and as he entered, Mr. Carless smote his hand on the desk before him. "This is certain!" he exclaimed. "We must have this Miss Avice Wickham here! At once!" Chapter 18. Let him appear. 19 of the Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 19. Under Examination. Mr. Pawle nodded assent to this proposition and rose from his chair. "It's the only thing to do," he said. "We must get to the bottom of this as quickly as possible. Whether Miss Wickham can tell us much or little, we must know what she can tell. Let us all meet here again at 3 o'clock. I will send one of my clerks to fetch her. But let us be clear on one point. Are we to tell this young lady what our conclusions are regarding herself?" "Your conclusions?" said Mr. Carless with a sly smile. "We know nothing yet, you know, Pawle." "My conclusions, then," assented Mr. Pawle, "are we " Lord Ellingham quietly interrupted the old lawyer. "Pardon me, Mr. Pawle," he said, "but before we go any further, do you mind telling me briefly what your conclusions really are?" "I will tell your lordship in a few words," answered Mr. Pawle readily. "Wrong or right, my conclusions are these. From certain investigations which Mr. Viner and I have made since this affair began, with the murder of Ashton, and from certain evidence which we have unearthed, I believe that Ashton's friend Wickham, the father of the girl we are going to produce this afternoon, was in reality your lordship's uncle, the missing Lord Marketstoke. I believe that Ashton came to England in order to prove this, and that he was probably about to begin proceedings when he was murdered, for the sake of those papers which we have just seen. And I believe, too, that we have not seen all the papers which were stolen from his dead body. What was produced to us just now by Methley and Woodlesford was a selection. The probability is that there are other and more important papers in the hands of the murderer, whose cat's paw or accomplice this claimant, whoever he may be, is. I believe," concluded Mr. Pawle with emphasis, "that my conclusions will be found to be correct ones, based on indisputable fact." Lord Ellingham looked from one solicitor to the other. Then he said with something of a smile. "If Wickham was really my uncle, Lord Marketstoke, and this young lady you tell me of is his daughter, what, definitely, is my position?" Mr. Pawle looked at Mr. Carless, and Mr. Carless shook his head. "If Mr. Pawle's theory is correct," he said, "and mind you, Pawle, it will take a lot of proving. If Mr. Pawle's theory is correct, the position, my lord, is this. The young lady we hear of is Countess of Ellingham in her own right. She would not be the first woman to succeed to the title. There was a Countess of Ellingham in the time of George III. She would, of course, have to prove her claim before the House of Lords; if made good, she succeeds to titles and estates. That's the plain English of it, and upon my honour," concluded Mr. Carless, "it's one of the most extraordinary things I ever heard of. This other affair is nothing to it." Lord Ellingham again inspected the legal countenances. "I see nothing at all improbable about it," he said. "We may as well face that fact at once. I will be here at 3 o'clock, Mr. Carless. I confess I should like to meet my cousin, if she really is that." "Your lordship takes it admirably," exclaimed Mr. Carless. "But really well, I don't know. However, we shall see. But 'pon my honour, it's most odd. One claimant disposed of, another, a more formidable one, comes on." "But we have not disposed of the first, have we?" suggested Lord Ellingham. "I don't anticipate any trouble in that quarter," answered Mr. Carless. "As I said to those two who have just gone out, send or bring the man here, and we'll tell in 1 minute if he's what he claims to be." "But how?" asked Lord Ellingham. "You seem very certain." "Dead certain," asserted Mr. Carless. He looked round his callers and laughed. "I may as well tell you," he said. "Portlethwaite drew me aside to remind me of it. The real Lord Marketstoke, if he were alive, could easily be identified. He lost a finger when a mere boy." "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle. "Good! Excellent! Best bit of evidence I've heard of. Hang this claimant! Now we can tell if Wickham really was Lord Marketstoke. If necessary, we can have his body exhumed and examined." "It was a shooting accident," continued Mr. Carless. "He was out shooting in the park at Ellingham when a boy of 14 or 15. He was using an old muzzle loading gun. It burst and he lost his second finger, the right hand. It was, of course, very noticeable. Now that small but very important fact is most likely not known to Methley and Woodlesford clients, but it's known to Driver and to Portlethwaite and to me, and now to all of you. If this man comes here, look at his right hand. If he possesses his full complement of fingers, well " Mr. Carless ended with a significant grimace, and Mr. Pawle, nodding assent, returned to the question which he was putting when Lord Ellingham interrupted him. "Now let us settle the point I raised," he said. "Are we to tell Miss Wickham what my conclusions are, or are we to leave her in ignorance until we get proof that they are correct?" "Or incorrect," answered Mr. Carless with an admonitory laugh. "I should say at present, tell her nothing. Let us find out all we can from her. There are several questions I should like to ask her, myself, arising out of what you have told us. Leave all the rest until a later period. If your theory is correct, Pawle, it can be established. If it isn't, the girl may as well be left in ignorance that you ever raised it." "Until 3 o'clock, then," said Mr. Pawle. 3 o'clock found the old lawyer and Viner pacing the pavement of Lincoln's Inn Fields in expectation of Miss Wickham's arrival. She came at last in the taxicab which Mr. Pawle had sent for her, and her first words on stepping out of it were of surprise and inquiry. "What is it, Mr. Pawle?" she demanded as she shook hands with her two squires. "More questions? What's it all about?" Mr. Pawle nudged Viner's arm. "My dear young lady," he answered in grave and fatherly fashion, "you must bear in mind that a man's life is in danger. We are doing all we can to clear that unfortunate young fellow Hyde of the dreadful charge which has been brought against him, and to do that we must get to know all we can about your late guardian, you know." "I know so little about Mr. Ashton," said Miss Wickham, looking apprehensively at the building towards which she was being conducted. "Where are you taking me?" "To a solicitor's office, friends of mine," answered Mr. Pawle. "Carless and Driver, excellent people. Mr. Carless wants to ask you a few questions in the hope that your answers will give us a little more light on Ashton's history. You needn't be afraid of Carless," he added, as they began to climb the stairs. "Carless is quite a pleasant fellow, and he has with him a very amiable young gentleman, Lord Ellingham, of whom you needn't be afraid either." "And why is Lord Ellingham, whoever he may be, there?" inquired Miss Wickham. "Lord Ellingham is also interested in your late guardian," replied Mr. Pawle. "In fact, we are all interested. So now, rub up your memory and answer Mr. Carless's questions." Viner remained in the background, quietly watching, while Mr. Pawle effected the necessary introductions. He was at once struck by what seemed to him an indisputable fact between Lord Ellingham and Miss Wickham. There was an unmistakable family likeness, and he judged from the curious scrutinizing look which Mr. Carless gave the two young people as they shook hands that the same idea struck him. Mr. Carless wound up that look in a significant glance at Mr. Pawle, to whom he suddenly muttered a few words which Viner caught. "By Jove!" he whispered. "I shouldn't wonder if you're right." Then he placed Miss Wickham in an easy chair on his right hand and cast a preliminary benevolent glance on her. "Mr. Pawle," he began, "has told us of your relationship with the late Mr. Ashton. You always regarded him as your guardian?" "He was my guardian," answered Miss Wickham. "My father left me in his charge." "Just so. Now, have you any recollection of your father?" "Only very vague recollections. I was scarcely 6, I think, when he died." "What do you remember about him?" "I think he was a tall, handsome man. I have some impression that he was. I think, too, that he had a fair complexion and hair. But it's all very vague." "Do you remember where you lived?" "Only that it was in a very big town. Melbourne, of course." "I have recollections of busy streets. I remember, too, that when I left there it was very, very hot weather." "Do you remember Mr. Ashton at that time?" "Oh, yes, I remember Mr. Ashton. I had nobody else, you see. My mother had died when I was quite little. I have no recollection whatever of her. I remember Mr. Ashton's house, and that he used to buy me lots of toys. His house was in a quiet part of the town, and he had a big shady garden." "How long, so far as you remember, did you live with Mr. Ashton there?" "Not very long, I think. He told me that I was to go to England to school. For a little time before we sailed I lived with Mrs. Roscoe, with whom I came to England. She was very kind to me. I was very fond of her." "And who was Mrs. Roscoe?" "I didn't know at the time, of course. I only knew she was Mrs. Roscoe. But Mr. Ashton told me not long before his death who she was. She was the widow of some government official, and she was returning to England in consequence of his death, so she took charge of me and brought me over. She used to visit me regularly at school, every week, and I used to spend my holidays with her until she died." "Ah!" said Mr. Carless. "She is dead?" "She died 2 years ago," answered Miss Wickham. "I wish she had been living," observed Mr. Carless with a glance at Mr. Pawle. "I should have liked to see Mrs. Roscoe. Well," he continued, turning to Miss Wickham, "so Mrs. Roscoe brought you to England to school. What school?" "Ryedene School." "Ryedene? That's one of the most expensive schools in England, isn't it?" "I don't know. Perhaps it is." "I happen to know it is," said Mr. Carless dryly. "Two of my clients have daughters there now. I've seen their bills. Do you know who paid yours?" "No," she answered. "I don't know. Mr. Ashton, I suppose." "You had everything you wanted, I dare say? Clothes, pocket money, and so on?" "I've always had everything I wanted," replied Miss Wickham. "And you were at Ryedene 12 years?" "Except for the holidays, yes." "You must be a very learned young lady," suggested Mr. Carless. Miss Wickham looked round the circle of attentive faces. "I can play tennis and hockey very well," she said, smiling a little. and I wasn't bad at cricket the last season or two. We played cricket there. But I'm not up to much at anything else, except that I can talk French decently." "Physical culture, eh?" observed Mr. Carless, smiling. "Very well. Now then, in the end, Mr. Ashton came home to England, and of course came to see you, and in due course you left school and came to his house in Markendale Square, where he got a Mrs. Killenhall to look after you. All that correct? Yes. Well then, I think from what Mr. Pawle tells me, Mr. Ashton handed over a lot of money to you and told you it had been left to you, or left in his charge for you, by your father. That is correct, too? Very well. Now, did Mr. Ashton never tell you anything much about your father?" "No, he never did. Beyond telling me that my father was an Englishman who had gone out to Australia and settled there, he never told me anything. But" here Miss Wickham paused and hesitated for a while, "I have an idea," she continued in the end, "that he meant to tell me something. What, I of course don't know. He once or twice hinted that he would tell me something, some day." "You didn't press him?" suggested Mr. Carless. "I don't think I am naturally inquisitive," replied Miss Wickham. "I certainly did not press him. I knew he'd tell me, whatever it was, in his own way." "One or two other questions," said Mr. Carless. "Do you know who your mother was?" "Only that she was some one whom my father met in Australia." "Do you know what her maiden name was?" "No. Only her Christian name. That was Catherine. She and my father are buried together." "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Carless. "That is something else I was going to ask. You know where they are buried?" "Oh, yes. Because before we sailed, Mrs. Roscombe took me to the churchyard or cemetery to see my father's and mother's grave. I remembered that perfectly. Her own husband was buried there too, close by. I remember how we both cried." Mr. Carless suddenly pointed to the ornament which Miss Wickham was wearing. "Will you take that off and let me look at it?" he asked. "Thank you," he said as she somewhat surprisedly obeyed. "I believe," he continued, as he quietly passed the ornament to Lord Ellingham, "that Mr. Ashton gave you this and told you it had belonged to your father. Just so. Well," he concluded, handing the ornament back, "I think that's all. Much obliged to you, Miss Wickham. You won't understand all this, but you will later. Now, one of my clerks will get you a car, and we'll escort you down to it." "No," said Lord Ellingham, promptly jumping to his feet. "Allow me. I'm youngest. If Miss Wickham will let me." The two young people went out of the room together, and the three men left behind looked at each other. There was a brief and significant silence. "Well, Carless?" said Mr. Pawle at last. "How now?" "'Pon my honour," answered Mr. Carless, "I shouldn't wonder if you're right." Chapter 19. Under Examination. Chapter 20 of The Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 20. Surprising Readiness. Mr. Pawle made a gesture which seemed to denote a certain amount of triumphant self-satisfaction. "I'm sure I'm right!" he exclaimed. "You'll find out that I'm right. But there's a tremendous lot to do, Carless. If only that unfortunate man Ashton had lived, he could have cleared this matter up at once. I feel convinced that he possessed papers which would have proved this girl's claim beyond dispute. Those papers, of course—" "Now, what particular papers are you thinking of?" interrupted Mr. Carless. "Well," replied Mr. Pawle, "such papers as proofs of her father's marriage and of her own birth. According to what she told us just now, her father was married in Australia and she herself was born there. There must be documentary proof of that." "Her father was probably married under his assumed name of Wickham," observed Mr. Carless. "You'll have to prove that Wickham and Lord Marketstoke were identical, were one and the same person. The fact is, Pawle, if this girl's claim is persisted in, there'll have to be a very searching inquiry made in Australia. However much I may feel that your theory may be, probably is, right, I should have to advise my client, Lord Ellingham, to insist on the most complete investigation." To be sure," assented Mr. Pawle. "That's absolutely necessary. But my own impression is that as we get into the secret of Ashton's murder, as I make no doubt we shall, there will be more evidence forthcoming. Now, as regards this man, whoever he is, who claims to be the missing Lord Marketstoke." At that moment a clerk entered the room and glanced at Mr. Carless. "Telephone message from Methley and Woodlesford, sir," he announced. "Mr. Methley's compliments, and if agreeable to you, he can bring his client on to see you this afternoon, at once, if convenient." Mr. Carless looked at Mr. Pawle, and Mr. Pawle nodded a silent assent. "Tell Mr. Methley it's quite agreeable and convenient," answered Mr. Carless. "I shall be glad to see them both at once." He muttered when the clerk had withdrawn. "Somewhat sudden, eh, Pawle? You might almost call it suspicious alacrity. Evidently the gentleman has no fear of meeting us." "You may be quite certain, Carless, if my theory about the whole thing is a sound theory, that the gentleman will have no fear of meeting anybody, not even a judge and jury," answered Mr. Pawle sardonically. "If I apprehend things rightly, he'll have been very carefully coached and prepared." "You think there's a secret conspiracy behind all this?" suggested Mr. Carless. "With this claimant as cat's paw, well tutored to his task?" "I do," affirmed Mr. Pawle. "Emphatically, I do." "Aye, well," said Mr. Carless, "don't forget what I told you about the missing finger middle finger of the right hand. And I'll have Driver in here, and Portlethwaite too. We'll see if he knows which is which of the three of us. I'll go and prepare them." He returned presently with his partner, a quiet, elderly man. A few minutes later Portlethwaite, evidently keenly interested, joined them. They and Mr. Pawle began to discuss certain legal matters connected with the immediate business, and Viner purposely withdrew to a corner of the room, intent on silently watching whatever followed on the arrival of the visitors. A quarter of an hour later Methley was shown into the room, and the five men gathered there turned with one accord to look at his companion, a tall, fresh-coloured, slightly grey-haired man of distinctly high-bred appearance, who, Viner saw at once, was much more self-possessed and assured in manner than any of the men who rose to meet him. "My client, Mr. Cave, who claims to be Earl of Ellingham," said Methley by way of introduction. "Mr. Carr." But the other men smiled quietly and immediately assumed a lead. "There is no need of introduction, Mr. Methley," he said. "I remember all three gentlemen perfectly. Mr. Carless, Mr. Driver, and yes, to be sure, Mr. Portlethwaite. I have a good memory for faces." He bowed to each man as he named him, and smiled again. "Whether these gentlemen remember me as well as I remember them," he remarked, "is another question." "May I offer you a chair?" said Mr. Carless. The visitor bowed, sat down, and took off his gloves, and in the silence which followed, Viner saw that the eyes of Driver, Carless, Pawle, and Portlethwaite were all steadily directed on the claimant's right hand. He himself turned to it, too, with no small interest. The next instant he was conscious that an atmosphere of astonishment and surprise had been set up in that room. For the middle finger of the man's right hand was missing. Viner felt, rather than saw, that the three solicitors and the elderly clerk were exchanging glances of amazement, and he fancied that Mr. Carless's voice, which had sounded cold and non-committal as he offered the visitor a seat, was somewhat uncertain when he turned to address him. "You claim, sir, to be the Lord Marketstoke who disappeared so many years ago?" he asked, eyeing the claimant over. "I claim to be exactly what I am, Mr. Carless," answered the visitor with another ready and pleasant smile. "I hope your memory will come to your aid." "When a man has disappeared absolutely for something like 35 years," remarked Mr. Carless, "those whom he has left behind may well be excused if their memories don't readily respond to sudden demands. But I should like to ask you some questions. Did you see the advertisements which were issued broadcast at the time of the 7th Earl of Ellingham's death?" "Yes, in several English and colonial papers," answered the claimant. "Why did you not reply to them?" "At that time I still persevered in my intention of never again having anything to do with my old life. I had no desire at all to come forward and claim my rights. So I took no notice of your advertisements." "And since then, of late, to be exact, you have changed your mind?" suggested Mr. Carless dryly. "To a certain extent only," replied the visitor, whose calm assurance was evidently impressing the legal practitioners around him. "I have already told Mr. Methley and his partner, Mr. Woodlesford, that I have no desire to assume my title nor to require possession of the estates, which are certainly mine. I have lived a free life too long to wish for what I should come in for if I established my claim, but I have a right to a share in the property which I quite willingly resign to my nephew." "In plain language," said Mr. Carless, "if you are paid a certain considerable sum of money, you will vanish again into the obscurity from whence you came. Am I right in that supposition?" "I don't like your terminology, Mr. Carless," answered the visitor with a slight frown. "I have not lived in obscurity, and " "If you are what you claim to be, sir, you are Earl of Ellingham," said Mr. Carless firmly. "And I may as well tell you at once that if you prove to us that you are, your nephew, who now holds title and estates, will at once relinquish both. There will be no bargaining. It is all or nothing. Our client, whom we know as Earl of Ellingham, is not going to traffic. If you are what you claim to be, you are head of the family and must take your place." "We could have told you that, once for all, if you had come to us in the first instance," remarked Mr. Driver. "Any other idea is out of the question. It seems to me most remarkable that such a notion as that which you suggest should ever enter your head, sir. If you are Earl of Ellingham, you are." "And that reminds me," said Mr. Carless, "that there is another question I should like to ask. Why, knowing that we have been legal advisers to your family for several generations, did you not come straight to us instead of going, Mr. Methley, I am sure will pardon me, to a firm of solicitors which, as far as I know, has never had any connection with it?" "I thought it best to employ absolutely independent advice," replied the visitor, "and I still think I was right. For example, you evidently do not admit my claim." "We certainly admit nothing at present," declared Mr. Carless with a laugh. "It would be absurd to expect it. The proofs which your solicitor showed us this morning are no proofs at all. That those papers belong to the missing Lord Marketstoke there is no doubt, but your possession of them at present does not prove that you are Lord Marketstoke or Lord Ellingham. They may have been stolen." The claimant rose from his chair with a good deal of dignity. He glanced at Methley. "I do not see that any good can come of this interview, Mr. Methley," he remarked in quiet, level tones. "I am evidently to be treated as an imposter. In that case," he bowed ceremoniously to the men gathered round Mr. Carless's desk, "I think it best to withdraw." Therewith he walked out of the room, and Methley, after a quiet word with Carless, followed, to be stopped in the corridor for a second time that day by Viner, who had hurried after him. "I'm not going to express any opinion on what we've just heard," whispered Viner, drawing Methley aside. "But in view of what I told you this morning, there's something I want you to do for me." "Yes," said Methley. "What?" "That unlucky fellow Hyde, who is on remand, is to be brought before the magistrate tomorrow morning," answered Viner. "Get him, this claimant, there, to attend the court as a spectator. Go with him. Use any argument you like, but get him there. I've a reason which I'll explain later." "I'll do my best," promised Methley. "And I've an idea of what's on your mind. You want to find out if Hyde can recognize him as the man whom he met at the Markendale Square end of Lonsdale Passage." "Well, that is my idea," assented Viner. "So get him there." Methley nodded and turned away. Then he turned back and pointed at Carless's room. "What do they really think in there?" he whispered. "Tell me, between ourselves." "That he's an imposter, and that there's a conspiracy," replied Viner. Methley nodded again, and Viner went back. The men whom he had left were talking excitedly. "It was the only course to take," Mr. Carless was declaring. "Uncompromising hostility. We could do no other. You saw quite well that he was all for money. I will engage that we could have settled with him for one half of what he asked. But who is he?" "The middle finger of his right hand is gone," said Mr. Pawle, who had been very quiet and thoughtful during these recent proceedings. "Remember that, Carless." "A most extraordinary coincidence!" exclaimed Mr. Carless excitedly. "I don't care twopence what anybody says. We all know that the most surprising coincidences do occur. Nothing but a coincidence. I assert what is it, Portlethwaite?" The elderly clerk had been manifesting a strong desire to get in a word, and he now rapped his senior employer's elbow. "Mr. Carless," he said earnestly, "you know that before I came to you, now nearly 40 years ago, I was a medical student. You know, too, you and Mr. Driver, why I gave up medicine for the law. But I haven't forgotten all of that I learned in the medical schools and hospitals." "Well, Portlethwaite?" demanded Mr. Carless. "What is it? You've some idea?" "Gentlemen," answered the elderly clerk, "I was always particularly interested in anatomy in my medical student days. I've been looking attentively at what I could see of that man's injured finger since he sat down at that desk. And I'll lay all I have that he lost the 2 joints of that finger within the last 3 months. The scar over the stump had not long been healed. That's a fact." Mr. Carless looked round with a triumphant smile. "There!" he exclaimed. "What did I tell you? Coincidence? Nothing but coincidence!" But Portlethwaite shook his head. "Why not say design, Mr. Carless?" he said meaningly. "Why not say design? If this man, or the people who are behind him, knew that the real Lord Marketstoke had a finger missing, what easier, in view of the stake they're playing for, than to remove one of this man's fingers? Design, sir, design all part of the scheme." The elderly clerk's listeners looked at each other. "I'll tell you what it is!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle with sudden emphasis. "The more we see and hear of this affair, the more I'm convinced that it is, as Portlethwaite says, a conspiracy. You know, that fellow who has just been here was distinctly taken aback when you, Carless, informed him that it was going to be a case of all or nothing. He, or the folk behind him, evidently expected that they'd be able to effect a money settlement. Now, I should say that the real reason of his somewhat hasty retirement was that he wanted to consult his principal, or principals. Did you notice that he was not really affronted by your remark? Not he! His personal dignity wasn't ruffled a bit. He was taken aback. He's gone off to consult. Carless, you ought to have that man carefully shadowed, to see where and to whom he goes." "Good idea," muttered Mr. Driver. "We might see to that." "I can put a splendid man on to him at once, Mr. Carless," remarked Portlethwaite, "if you could furnish me with his address." "Methley and Woodlesford know it," said Mr. Carless. Yes, that might be very useful. Ring Methley's up, Portlethwaite, and ask if they would oblige us with the name of Mr. Cape's hotel some residential hotel in Lancaster Gate, I believe." Mr. Pawle and Viner went away, ruminating over the recent events, and walked to the old lawyer's offices in Bedford Row. Mr. Pawle's own particular clerk met them as they entered. "There's Mr. Roland Perkwite of the Middle Temple in your room, sir," he said, addressing his master. "You may remember him, sir. We've briefed him once or twice in some small cases. Mr. Perkwite wants to see you about this Ashton affair. He says he has something to tell you." Mr. Pawle looked at Viner and beckoned him to follow. "Here a little and there a little," he whispered. "What are we going to hear this time?" End of chapter 20. Surprising readiness. Chapter 21 of The Middle of Things. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle of Things by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 21. The Marseilles Meeting. The man who was waiting in Mr. Pawle's room, and who rose from his chair with alacrity as the old lawyer entered with Viner at his heels, was an alert, sharp-eyed person of something under middle age, whose clean-shaven countenance and general air immediately suggested the law courts. And he went straight to business before he had released the hand which Mr. Pawle extended to him. "Your clerk has no doubt already told you what I came about, Mr. Pawle," he said. "This Ashton affair." "Just so," answered Mr. Pawle. "You know something about it. This gentleman is Mr. Richard Viner, who is interested in it considerably." "To be sure," said the barrister. "One of the witnesses, of course. I read the whole thing up last night. I have been on the Continent, the French Riviera, Italy, the Austrian Tyrol for some time, Mr. Pawle, and only returned to town yesterday. I saw something in an English newspaper in Paris the other day about this Ashton business, and as my clerk keeps the Times for me when I am absent, last night I read over the proceedings before the magistrate and before the coroner. And of course I saw your request for information about Ashton and his recent movements." "And you've some to give?" asked Mr. Pawle. "I have some to give," assented Mr. Perkwite, as the three men sat down by Mr. Pawle's desk. "Certainly, and I should say it's of considerable importance. The fact is, I met Ashton at Marseilles, and spent the better part of the week in his company at the Hotel de Louvre there." "When was that?" asked Mr. Pawle. "About 3 months ago," replied the barrister. "I had gone straight to Marseilles from London. He had come there from Italy by way of Monte Carlo and Nice. We happened to get into conversation on the night of my arrival, and we afterwards spent most of our time together. and finding out that I was a barrister, he confided certain things to me and asked my advice." "Aye, and on what now?" inquired the old lawyer. "It was the last night we were together," replied Mr. Perkwite. "We had by that time become very friendly, and I had promised to renew our acquaintance on my return to London, where Ashton told me he intended to settle down for the rest of his life. Now, on that last evening at Marseilles, I had been telling him after dinner of some curious legal cases, and he suddenly remarked that he would like to tell me of a matter which might come within the law, and on which he should be glad of advice. He then asked me if I had ever heard of the strange disappearance of Lord Marketstoke, heir to the 7th Earl of Ellingham. I replied that I had at the time when application was made to the courts for leave to presume Lord Marketstoke's death. Thereupon, pledging me to secrecy for the time being, Ashton went on to tell me that Lord Marketstoke was well known to him, and that he alone knew all the facts of the matter, though a certain amount of them was known to another man now living in London. He said that Marketstoke, after a final quarrel with his father, left England in such a fashion that no one could trace him, taking with him the fortune which he had inherited from his mother, and eventually settled in Australia, where he henceforth lived under the name of Wickham. According to Ashton, he and Marketstoke became friends, close friends at a very early period of Marketstoke's career in Australia, and the friendship deepened and existed until Marketstoke's death some 12 or 13 years ago. But Ashton never had the slightest notion of Marketstoke's real identity until his friend's last days. Then Marketstoke told him the plain truth, and the fact who he really was at the same time was confided to another man who, however, was not told all the details which were given to Ashton. Now, Marketstoke had married in Australia. His wife was dead, but he had a daughter who was about 6 years of age at the time of her father's death. Marketstoke confided her to Ashton with a wish that she should be sent home to England to be educated. He also handed over to Ashton a considerable sum of money for this child. Further, he gave him a quantity of papers, letters, family documents, and so on. He had a purpose. He left it to Ashton, in whom he evidently had the most absolute confidence, as to whether this girl's claim to the title and estates should be set up. And when Ashton had finished telling me all this, I found that one of his principal reasons in coming to England to settle down was the wish to find out how things were with the present holder of the title. If, he said, he discovered that he was a worthy sort of young fellow, he, Ashton, should be inclined to let the secret die with him. He told me that the girl already had some £12,000 of her own, and that it was his intention to leave her the whole of his own fortune. And as she was absolutely ignorant of her real position, he might perhaps leave her so. But in view of the possibility of his setting up her claim, he asked me some questions on legal points, and of course I asked him to let me see the papers of which he had spoken." "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle with a sigh of relieved satisfaction. "Then you saw them?" "Yes, he showed me the whole lot," replied Mr. Perkwite. "Not so many, after all, those that were really pertinent, at any rate. He carried those in a pocket-book, had so carried them, he told me, ever since Marketstoke had handed them to him. They had never, he added, been out of his possession, day or night, since Marketstoke's death. Now, on examining the papers, I at once discovered two highly important facts. Although Marketstoke went to and lived in Australia under the name of Wickham, he had taken good care to get married in his own proper name, and there, amongst the documents, was the marriage certificate, in which he was correctly described. Further, his daughter had been correctly designated in the register of her birth. There was a copy, properly attested, of the entry." Mr. Pawle glanced at Viner, and Viner knew what he was thinking of. The two documents just described by Mr. Perkwite had not been among the papers which Methley and Woodlesford had exhibited at Carless and Driver's office. "A moment," said Mr. Pawle, lifting an arresting finger. "Did you happen to notice where this marriage took place?" "It was not in Melbourne," replied Mr. Perkwite. "My recollection is that it was at some place of a curious name. Ashton told me that Marketstoke's wife had been a governess in the family of some well-to-do sheep farmer. She was an English girl, and an orphan. The child, however, was certainly born in Melbourne and registered in Melbourne." "Now that's odd," remarked Mr. Pawle. "You'd have thought that when Lord Marketstoke was so extensively advertised for some years ago, on the death of his father, some of these officials—" "Ah, I put that point to Ashton," interrupted Mr. Perkwite. "He said that Marketstoke, though he had taken good care to be married in his own name and had exercised equal precaution about his daughter, had pledged everybody connected with his marriage and the child's birth to secrecy." "Aye," muttered Mr. Pawle. "He would do that, of course. But continue." "Well," said the barrister, "after seeing these papers I had no doubt whatever that the case as presented by Ashton was quite clear, and that his ward, Miss Avice Wickham, is without doubt Countess of Ellingham the title, I understand, going in the female as well as the male line and rightful owner of the estates. And I told him that his best plan, on reaching England, was to put the whole matter before the family solicitors. However, he said that before doing that there were two things he wanted to do. One was to find out for himself how things were, if the young Earl was a satisfactory landlord, and so on, and likely to be a credit to the family. The other was that he wanted to consult the man who shared with him the bare knowledge that the man who had been known in Melbourne as Wickham was really the missing Lord Marketstoke. And he added that he had already telegraphed to this man to meet him in Paris." "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle, with a look in Viner's direction. "Now we are indeed coming to something. He was to meet him in Paris. Viner, I'll wager the world against a China orange that that's the man whom Armitstead saw in company with Ashton in the Rue Royale, and no doubt the man of Lonsdale Passage. Mr. Perkwite, this is most important. Did Ashton tell you the name of this man?" The old lawyer was tremulous with excited interest, and Mr. Perkwite was obviously sorry to disappoint him. "Unfortunately, he did not," he replied. "He merely told me that he was a man who had lived in Melbourne for some time and had known Marketstoke and himself very intimately, had left Melbourne just after Marketstoke's death, and had settled in London. No, he did not mention his name." "Disappointing," muttered Mr. Pawle. "That's the nearest approach to a clue that we've had, Perkwite. If we only knew who that man was! But what more can you tell us?" "Nothing more, I'm afraid," answered the barrister. "I promised to call on Ashton when I returned to London and when he had started housekeeping, and we parted. I went on next morning to Genoa, and he set off for Paris. He was a pleasant, kindly, sociable fellow," concluded Mr. Perkwite, "and I was much grieved to hear of his sad fate." "He didn't correspond with you at all after you left him at Marseilles?" asked Mr. Pawle. "No," replied the barrister. "No, I never heard of or from him until I read of his murder." Pawle turned to Viner. "I think we'd better tell Perkwite of all that's happened within our own ken," he said, and proceeded to give the visitor a brief account of the various important details. "Now," he concluded, "it seems to me there's only one conclusion to be arrived at. The man who shared the secret with Ashton is certainly the man whom Armitstead saw with him in Paris. He is probably the man whom Hyde saw leaving Lonsdale Passage just before Hyde found the body. And he is without doubt the murderer, and is the man to whom this claimant fellow is acting as cat's paw. And who is he?" "There must be some way of finding that out," observed Mr. Perkwite. "If your theory is correct, that this claimant is merely a man who is being put forward, then surely the thing to do is to get at the person or persons behind him through him." "Aye, there's that to be thought of," asserted Mr. Pawle. "But it may be a tougher job than we think for. It would have been a tremendous help if Ashton had only mentioned the name to you." "Sorry, but he didn't," said Mr. Perkwite. "You feel," he continued after a moment's silence, "you feel that this affair of the Ellingham succession lies at the root of the Ashton mystery, that he was really murdered by somebody who wanted to get possession of those papers?" "And to remain sole repository of the secret," declared Mr. Pawle. "Isn't it established that beyond yourself and this unknown man nobody but Ashton knew the secret?" "There is another matter, though," remarked Viner. He turned to the visitor. "You said that you and Ashton became very friendly and confidential during your stay in Marseilles. Pray, did he never show you anything of a valuable nature which he carried in his pocket-book?" The barrister's keen eyes suddenly lighted up with recollection. "Yes!" he exclaimed. "Now you come to suggest it, he did! A diamond!" "Ah!" said Mr. Pawle. "So you saw that?" "Yes, I saw it," assented Mr. Perkwite. "He showed it to me as a sort of curiosity, a stone which had some romantic history attaching to it, but I was not half as much interested in that as in the other affair." All the same, remarked Mr. Pawle, that diamond is worth some 50 or 60,000 pounds, Perkwite, and it's missing." Mr. Perkwite looked his astonishment. "You mean he had it on him when he was murdered?" he asked. "So it's believed," replied Mr. Pawle. "In that case it might form a clue," said the barrister. "When it's heard of," admitted Mr. Pawle with a grim smile. "Not till then." "From what we have heard," remarked Viner, "Ashton carried that diamond in the pocketbook which contained his papers the papers you have told me of, and some of which have certainly come into possession of this claimant person. Now, whoever stole the papers, of course, got the diamond." Mr. Perkwite seemed to consider matters during a moment's silence. Finally he turned to the old lawyer. "I have been thinking over something that might be done," he said. "I see that the coroner's inquest was adjourned. Now, as that inquest is, of course, being held to inquire into the circumstances of Ashton's death, I suggest that I should come forward as a witness and should prove that Ashton showed certain papers relating to the Ellingham peerage to me at Marseilles. I can tell the story as a witness. It can then be proved by you or by Carless that a man claiming to be the missing Lord Marketstoke showed these stolen papers to you. In the meantime, get the coroner to summon this man as a witness, and take care that he's brought to the court. Once there, let him be asked how he came into possession of these papers. Do you see my idea?" "Capital!" exclaimed Mr. Pawle. "An excellent notion! Much obliged to you, Perkwite. It shall be done I'll see to it at once. Yes, to be sure, that will put this fellow in a tight corner." "Don't be surprised if he hasn't some very clever explanation to give," said the barrister warningly. "The whole thing is evidently a well concocted conspiracy. But when is the adjourned inquest?" "Day after tomorrow," replied Mr. Pawle, after glancing at his desk diary. "And tomorrow morning," remarked Viner, "Hyde comes up before the magistrate again on remand." He was half minded to tell Mr. Pawle there and then of his secret dealings with Methley that day, but on reflection he decided that he would keep the matter to himself. Viner had an idea which he had not communicated even to Methley. It had struck him that the mysterious Deus Machina, who was certainly at the back of all this business, might not improbably be so anxious about his schemes that he would, unknown and unsuspected, attend the magistrate's court. Would Hyde, his wits sharpened by danger, be able to spot him as the muffled man of Lonsdale Passage? Chapter 21 The Marseilles Meeting.